The morning the calves arrived was a Tuesday in October of 1987. I remember the air had that particular crispness to it, the kind that promises a hard frost is no more than a week off but hasn't delivered it yet. The sky was the color of old tin, a flat, washed-out gray that made the dying golds and reds of the oak trees along the fence line seem unnaturally bright. The truck that brought them was a rattling affair, a '74 Dodge with more rust than paint, and the man driving it looked about as worn as his vehicle. He'd called me from the sale barn the day before, said he had a lot nobody wanted, a remainder, 28 head of what he called scrub cattle, a mixed heritage breed with horns that grew every which way but straight. He said they were small, wild, and nobody in their right mind would bid on them for finishing. He offered them to me for a price so low it was more of a disposal fee than a purchase. I told him to bring them. I didn't tell him I'd been waiting for a call like that for nearly 20 years. When he opened the back of the trailer, they came out not like cattle but like deer, a frantic, fluid explosion of blacks, duns, and brindles. They were all angles and big, dark eyes, their coats shaggy and their backbones showing more than I'd like. They hit the ground and were gone, fanning out across the holding pen and into the lane that led to the back 40 acres, a piece of ground almost as dismissed as they were. They moved with a nervous energy, a kind of coiled spring vigilance you don't see in modern beef breeds that have had the fight and the sense bred out of them in favor of docile weight gain. My wife, Mary, stood on the porch, arms crossed, watching the whole transaction with an expression that was neither approving nor disapproving. It was the look she reserved for my projects that fell somewhere between sentiment and foolishness. She just shook her head slowly, a gesture I knew meant she was filing this away for a later conversation, likely one that would begin with the phrase, "I hope you know what you're doing." I watched the last of them, a little dun-colored heifer with one horn that curled down toward her eye, disappear over the rise. I felt a quiet satisfaction, the kind you get when you've finally done a thing you've been putting off for a long, long time. I was still standing there by the gate when I heard the sound of a newer engine, a clean sound, a low rumble that told me it was well-maintained and probably hadn't seen a muddy field in its life. It was my neighbor, Miller. He pulled up in his Ford F-250, a truck so polished you could check your teeth in the chrome of the bumper. He stopped but didn't shut off the engine, just idled there, the driver's side window humming down. Miller was a good neighbor in the practical sense. He'd help you pull a tractor out of the ditch and he'd never short you on fence repairs, but he farmed by the book. The University Extension Service book. His fields were perfect squares, his cattle were all registered Angus from the same two bloodlines, and he believed in data, not dirt. He leaned his arm on the windowsill. "Morning," he said. He nodded toward the now empty lane. "Saw the truck. Don't look like your usual stock." I leaned against the gatepost. "They're not," I said. "Something a little different." He squinted out at the back 40. Where you could just see the scattered specks of the calves moving through the dry grass. "Different is one word for it," he said. He wasn't being unkind, just stating a fact as he saw it. "Heard at the co-op you were taking on some auction leavings. They look wiry." "They're that," I agreed. He looked at me, a genuine confusion in his eyes. He was a man who understood inputs and outputs, cost per pound, rate of gain. What I was doing didn't fit any of the columns on his ledger. "That back 40 is about burnt up," he said, gesturing with his chin. "Has been since August. There's not enough forage out there to keep a goat happy, let alone near 30 head of cattle. What are you planning on doing with them?" It was a fair question. The back 40 was high ground, mostly clay and shale. It caught the sun and the wind, and by late summer it was always the first part of the farm to turn brown. It was pasture of last resort. I told him I was farming. That was all. Just, "I'm farming." He waited for more, for an explanation about a new kind of feed supplement or a protein tub strategy. I didn't offer one. The silence stretched out, filled only by the clean hum of his engine. Finally, he gave a slow nod, the kind a man gives when he's decided you're a lost cause but is too polite to say it. "All right then," he said, the words carrying a weight of finality. "Just don't be surprised if they lose what little weight they've got. Might see them chewing on your fence posts by Thanksgiving." He put the truck in gear and rolled away, leaving a small puff of dust hanging in the still morning air. I watched him go. He was a good man and a smart farmer. By every modern metric, he was right. I was putting hungry animals on hungry ground. It made no sense. But I had a reason, and it was older than any extension service bulletin. I didn't know yet what those 28 crooked-horned calves knew, what they would show me in the coming weeks. I didn't have the proof yet, only a story from a long time ago and a feeling in my gut as solid as fieldstone. The animal remembers what the map forgot. My grandfather had said that to me on that very piece of land, more than 50 years ago. And as I closed the gate, I was betting the farm on it. I turned and walked back toward the house, the faint, frantic bawling of the calves echoing from the dry hills. My real reason for buying those calves wasn't something you could explain to a man like Miller over the hood of a truck. It wasn't about economics, not in the way he understood them. It was rooted in a memory, a conversation I had with my grandfather when I was about 10 years old. We were walking the fence line of that same back 40, checking for brakes. It was a hot day in late July, and the air was thick with the smell of dust and baking grass. My grandfather was a quiet man, not given to long speeches. He taught me more by showing than by telling. He stopped at the highest point of the pasture, a little knob of land where the shale was so close to the surface the grass grew in thin, defeated patches. He pointed with his chin the same way Miller had. "See this piece of ground?" he'd said. "My father, your great-grandfather, he always said this land had a secret. Said the deer and the old wild cattle, the ones before all the fancy breeds, they knew it. They'd come up here when everything else was dry and find something." I asked him what they found. He just shrugged, a slow movement of his bony shoulders. "Never found out," he said. He never had the right kind of animal to show him. The new ones, the ones that come from gentle land, they don't know how to look. They just stand by the gate and wait for you to bring them what they need. He poked at the hard-baked ground with the toe of his boot. "But the old ones," he'd said, his voice dropping a little, "the ones that still have a little wild in them, they remember. The animal remembers what the map forgot." That conversation stuck with me. It became one of those foundational pieces of knowledge you carry around, waiting for the right moment to use it. For years, I farmed the way everyone else did. I raised good, solid Herefords and Angus crosses. I improved my pastures with clover and fescue. I followed the science. But I always kept that back 40 separate. I never plowed it, never tried to reseed it. I just let it be what it was, and I waited. The call about the scrub cattle felt like the other half of that memory finally arriving. These were the animals he'd talked about. They still had the wild in them. They were a key, and I hoped they would fit a lock I'd been staring at my whole life. The next person to confirm my foolishness was the county extension agent, a young man named Peterson. He was fresh out of the state university, full of enthusiasm and data sheets. He drove a county car, a white sedan that looked out of place on my gravel drive. He'd heard the story, of course. In a small community, news of 28 misfit calves travels fast. By noon, the diner had a version of the story, and by the time Peterson arrived, the version had grown to include me being on the verge of bankruptcy and making a last, desperate gamble. He came to the door with a clipboard and a genuinely concerned look on his face. "Mr. Davison," he said, "I was in the area and heard you'd acquired some new stock. Thought I'd stop by and see if there's any resources we can offer." It was a polite way of saying, "I'm here to talk you out of this." I invited him in for coffee, but he declined, preferring to stand on the porch where he could see the pasture in question. He pulled out a sheaf of papers from his clipboard. "I took the liberty of pulling the soil analysis and rainfall data for this section," he said, pointing to the back 40. "As you know, it's predominantly a shallow clay loam over shale. Low in organic matter, poor water retention. Based on the last 5 years of precipitation data and the current forage condition, the recommended stocking rate is, conservatively, 1 animal unit per 8 acres for seasonal grazing." He looked at me over the top of his papers. "You've got 28 head on 40 acres. That's almost 6 times the recommended density for this time of year. They're going to strip it bare in a week, and what's there won't provide enough protein to maintain their body condition, let alone add to it." He meant well. He was armed with facts and figures, with science. Everything he said was true according to the books. "I've seen it happen before," he continued, his voice earnest. "A producer gets behind, buys some cheap cattle hoping to turn a quick profit on marginal land. It never works. You'll spend more on hay trying to keep them alive through the winter than you'll ever get back from them at market. Have you considered investing in better genetics? We have programs to help with sourcing semen from proven Angus bulls. Over time, you could build a herd that maximizes your rate of gain on your better pastures." I listened patiently. I let him finish his entire speech. When he was done, I just nodded. "I appreciate you taking the time to come out, Mr. Peterson. I'll keep what you said in mind." The look on his face was one of pure frustration. He had given me the answer key, and I had refused to even look at it. He saw a man clinging to a bad decision for reasons he couldn't quantify. "Okay, well," he said, gathering his papers. "My card is on the table if you change your mind. I'd strongly suggest moving them off that pasture and starting them on a hay ration immediately." He left, and as his white sedan disappeared down the drive, I felt the first real flicker of doubt. The neighbor was one thing. Miller saw the world through his own lens of success. But Peterson was the voice of official knowledge, of the entire system I had been taught to trust. His numbers were cold and hard. 6 times the recommended stocking rate. It sounded like a recipe for disaster. I walked out to the edge of the yard and looked out at the back 40. The calves were still scattered, still moving. They looked small and fragile against the vast, dry landscape. For a moment, I saw what Miller and Peterson saw. A foolish old man, a patch of worthless ground, and a herd of cattle destined for starvation. The weight of their certainty was heavy. It's one thing to have a private belief, a quiet hunch based on an old story. It's another thing to have it tested against the full, confident force of modern expertise. I stood there for a long time, the tin-colored sky pressing down, and I'll own that I was scared. I had put my faith in a ghost story, and I was about to find out if it was true. That evening, the doubt followed me into the barn. The air inside was cool and smelled of old hay and dust, a scent that usually calmed me. But tonight it didn't. Peterson's words echoed in my head. 6 times the recommended density. I finished my chores, the motions automatic after a lifetime of repetition. I forked hay to the milk cow, checked the water troughs, closed up the chicken coop. With every step, the feeling grew that I had made a public and expensive mistake. I found myself standing in the middle of the barn's center aisle, the only light coming from a single bare bulb hanging from a dusty cord. This was the moment of truth. I could either sell the calves at a loss and admit I was wrong, or I could double down on a 50-year-old memory. I want to be honest about my reasons. It wasn't just stubbornness. It was a feeling that there was a different kind of knowledge, a kind that didn't fit on a data sheet. My grandfather had farmed this land through the Depression and the droughts of the 50s. He had survived by paying attention to things the books didn't talk about. I decided I owed it to him and to myself to see his story through. I put the pitchfork back, because I wasn't ready to give up yet. I walked to the back of the barn, to a corner that hadn't been disturbed in years. There was an old sea chest there, made of dark wood and bound with iron straps. It had belonged to my grandfather. Mary always said I should bring it in the house, that it would get ruined out here. But it felt right, leaving it in the barn. It was a working man's chest. I lifted the heavy lid. The smell of cedar and old paper rose up to meet me. Inside were the things a man leaves behind. A few worn-out tools with his initials burned into the handles, a folded flag, a small box of medals from the First War, and a stack of notebooks. They were mostly farm ledgers, records of expenses and yields. But underneath them was a smaller one. It was a pocket-sized ledger with a black, oilcloth cover, now soft and pliable with age. The corners were rounded from years of writing in a pocket. The edges of the pages were stained dark with grease and sweat. This was the one. This was his field book. I carried it over to the single bulb and sat down on an overturned bucket. The light was weak, casting long shadows around the barn. I opened the cover. The first page just said, John Davison, 1948. In my grandfather's careful, angular handwriting. The pencil was faded to a soft brown. I turned the pages slowly. It was a diary of the farm, written in a kind of shorthand. May 10th, planted corn, field 3. Hybrid 34B. Soil cool but dry. July 2nd. First cutting of alfalfa. 8 tons. Rain held off. November 1st. First snow. 2 inches. All stock in. It was a map of his year, of his attention. He noted the weather, the behavior of his animals, the price of feed at the co-op. He was a scientist of his own small world. I kept turning pages, looking for a specific entry. I knew the general layout of the farm from his notes, the names he used for fields that were different from the ones I used. Finally, I found it. A page with back 40 pasture written at the top. The entries were sparse. 1952. Fence line week on west side. Replaced 20 posts. 1954. Grass thin this year. Pulled cattle off July 15th. 1957. Walked the scour after the big rain. Water ran for 2 hours, he called the shallow. Winding gully that cut through the pasture, the scour. It was a detail I had forgotten. I read on, my heart beating a little faster. The entries were all practical, all grounded. There was no mention of any secret, no folklore. My doubt began to creep back in. Maybe I had built it up in my memory. Maybe the story was just something an old man told a young boy on a hot day. And then I saw it. At the very bottom of the page, below a note about a fox den from 1959, was a final entry. It was written in a slightly different pencil, a little darker, as if he'd added it later. It was just a few words, and he had drawn a faint, wavering circle around them. Salt trace? Below the dry scour. Never went deep, never went deep. The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't just a story. It was an observation. A question he had asked himself and recorded in his private book. He had seen something or tasted something or suspected something. A salt trace. In a pasture that was considered worthless, that would be a game changer. Salt, or more broadly, minerals, are the limiting factor for growth in many animals. They'll travel miles for it. It drives their behavior in ways that grass and water alone cannot. And then the last part of the note, never went deep. It wasn't a statement of fact. It was a confession of postponement. A loose thread he had never pulled. He had a farm to run, a family to feed. He had other pastures that produced other problems that were more immediate. Digging a hole in a dry pasture on a hunch was a luxury he couldn't afford. He noted the question and moved on. And now the question was mine to answer. I closed the notebook and held it in my hands. The flimsy cover felt as solid and heavy as a block of granite. This was no longer a ghost story. It was a treasure map. A cryptic, incomplete map, but a map nonetheless. The doubt that had been sitting on my shoulders all day lifted. The voices of Miller and Peterson faded away, replaced by the quiet, penciled words of my grandfather. I wasn't a fool making a sentimental gamble. I was an explorer, following the last instruction of the man who had explored this land before me. I stood up and switched off the barn light. The darkness that filled the space was no longer menacing. It was quiet and full of potential. The morning couldn't come soon enough. The next morning I was out before the sun. I didn't even make coffee, just pulled on my boots and a jacket over my pajamas and walked out into the pre-dawn chill. The air was still and cold, and a low fog clung to the hollows of the fields, making the world feel hushed and private. I didn't take a shovel, not yet. I didn't take an auger. The first step wasn't to dig. The first step was to watch. My grandfather's note gave me a location, below the dry scour. But the calves were the experts. If there was anything to find, they would be the ones to point the way. So I took a thermos of coffee Mary had silently placed on the counter for me and my own notebook, and I walked to the back 40. I found a spot on the upward slope, where a cluster of old cedars gave me some cover, and I sat down with my back against a trunk. From there, I could see almost the entire pasture as the sun began to slowly burn the gray off the eastern sky. The 28 calves were not where I expected them to be. They weren't spread out, grazing on the thin, frost-touched grass. They were clustered, not tightly but in a loose congregation in one specific area. It was on the lower side of the pasture, just as my grandfather's note suggested, along the gentle curve of the dry scour. This scour wasn't much to look at. It was a wide, shallow depression, maybe 20 feet across and only a couple of feet deep at its lowest point. For 50 weeks out of the year, it was as dry as the rest of the pasture. But after a torrential spring rain, it would hold a trickle of runoff for a day or two before the clay underneath sealed up and the sun baked it dry again. It was this clay bottom that the calves were interested in. As the light grew, I could see them more clearly. They weren't eating. The ground there was nearly bare, a hard pan of cracked, pale clay where only the most determined weeds could survive. Instead, they were walking slowly, heads down, sniffing the ground. Every so often, one of them would paw at the earth, scraping away the dry surface dust with a hoof. Then it would put its nose to the spot and inhale deeply. It was a strange, ritualistic-looking behavior. A few of the older, more established cattle on the main farm would occasionally eat dirt, a condition called pica, which usually meant a mineral deficiency. But this was different. This wasn't the random, desperate act of a single sick animal. This was the focused, collective behavior of an entire herd. They knew something was here. They were drawn to this one specific 50-yard stretch of the scour. For the rest of that day and the day after, I did nothing but watch. I became a student of those calves. I learned their individual markings, the hierarchy of the small herd. I filled pages of my notebook with observations.
7 a.m.
Herd clustered on east end of scour, mostly sniffing, some pawing. Brindle heifer is most active, 11:30 a.m. Herd has moved up to graze on the higher ground. Spread out now. Normal behavior, 4 p.m. They're back. Drifting back down to the scour as the sun gets lower. Same spot. They were like a tide, pulled by a force I couldn't see. They would graze the wider pasture for sustenance, but they would return to the scour for something else, something they craved. On the third day, I walked the area myself when the calves were away. I got down on my hands and knees. The ground was as hard as concrete. The dust was fine and pale. I smelled it. There was nothing, just the dry, flat smell of clay. I scraped away the top layer with my pocket knife. The earth beneath was slightly darker, more compacted. I tasted a tiny pinch of it. It was just dirt. Gritty, tasteless, disappointing. I stood up and felt a familiar wave of doubt wash over me. What if I was just seeing what I wanted to see? Projecting my hopes onto the random milling of animals? My grandfather's note said salt trace. I wasn't finding a trace of anything. I leaned against a fence post and looked at my own notes. The pattern was undeniable. They weren't drawn to the whole scour, just this one section. Why? What was different here? I started walking the scour from end to end, my eyes on the ground. Most of it was uniform, the same cracked clay. But as I approached the area the calves favored, I saw a subtle change. The cracks in the ground were finer, more numerous. And in the bottom of some of the deeper cracks, the soil color was a shade darker, a deep, damp-looking brown against the pale gray. It wasn't wet to the touch, but it held a memory of moisture. I walked further, past the area of interest, and the cracks became wide and shallow again. The darker soil vanished. I went back. The calves had pinpointed a geological anomaly, a place where the substrate was different, even if only by a few degrees. They weren't wrong. They were reading a language in the earth that I was blind to. The animal remembers what the map forgot. My grandfather's words came back to me, but now they had a new weight. The map wasn't just a piece of paper from the county office. The map was my own perception, my own limited human senses. The calves had a better map. They had instinct, an inherited memory passed down through generations of ancestors who had survived on marginal land. They knew the scent of deep earth, the subtle signal of a mineral presence that was too faint for my nose or my tongue to detect from the surface. The investigation wasn't over. It had just begun. The calves had given me the X on the map. Now it was my turn to dig. And as I walked back to the barn to get the auger, I knew I wouldn't be giving up this time, no matter how hard the ground was. After a week of observation, I was certain. The calves had shown me the spot. Now I had to get past the surface and see what they were so interested in. I went to the implement shed, a long, low building filled with the tools and ghosts of 3 generations. In the back, leaning against the wall, was the old hand auger. It was a simple tool, a T-handle made of smooth, dark ash and a long steel shaft with a screw bit at the end. The wood of the handles was worn into gentle curves where my father's and my grandfather's hands had held it. It was a tool for testing soil depth, for setting fence posts in tight spots, a tool for asking questions of the ground. I carried it out to the back 40. It was mid-morning, and the calves were grazing up on the ridge, leaving the scour open for me. I walked to the very center of the area they favored, the place with the fine cracks and the hint of darker soil deep within them. I set the point of the auger on the baked clay and planted my feet. I began to turn. The first few inches were brutal. The ground was a sun-fired brick, and the auger bit scraped and shrieked, kicking up a fine, choking dust. My arms and back protested. It was slow, grueling work, a quarter turn at a time. After 10 minutes of sweat and strain, I had barely managed to get 6 inches down. I pulled the auger up to clear the bit. The soil was just what I expected. Dry, pale gray clay, crumbling into dust as soon as it hit the air. I kept going. Down past a foot. The resistance didn't change. It was like drilling through rock. Every turn was a fight. The sun was climbing higher now, and sweat was running down my back. I could feel the doubt starting to whisper at the edges of my mind again. This was a fool's errand. I was a man in my 60s, alone in a field, drilling a hole to nowhere based on the behavior of some half-wild cattle and a cryptic note from 1959. It was around then that I heard the familiar, clean rumble of Miller's truck. He was driving on the farm lane that ran along the far side of the pasture. He slowed to a stop about 100 yards away. I couldn't see his face clearly, but I didn't need to. I could feel his gaze, the weight of his sensible, logical disbelief. I imagined his thoughts. Old man Davison has finally lost it completely. He's out there trying to dig a well with a post-hole auger. He watched me for a full minute, a silent, idling judgment on the horizon. Then, with a slow shake of his head that I could see even from that distance, he put the truck in gear and drove on. The dust from his tires hung in the air long after he was gone. I'll own that I felt a hot flush of embarrassment. I straightened up, my back aching, and looked at the pathetic hole I had made. It seemed absurd. I was ready to quit. I was ready to throw the auger down, walk back to the house and call the sale barn. I could take the loss, endure the quiet, I told you so's at the co-op, and go back to farming the way everyone knew was right. I leaned on the auger handle, catching my breath, and I closed my eyes. And in the quiet, I heard my grandfather's voice. Not the one from the notebook, but the one from my memory. He was teaching me how to witch for water with a willow branch when I was a boy. I had been frustrated, because the branch wouldn't move for me. He had put his hand on my shoulder and said, "You're trying to force it. You have to feel it. The water is there. It wants to be found. Thirst knows the way down, thirst knows the way down." The calves were thirsty, not for water but for something else. Their thirst knew the way. My job wasn't to force it. It was to follow. I opened my eyes. The embarrassment was gone, replaced by a cold resolve. I didn't care what Miller thought. I didn't care what Peterson's data sheet said. I was going to finish this. I gripped the ash handles again and went back to work. I went down past 2 feet. The soil was still dry, still resistant. But it was changing. The color was deepening, shifting from pale gray to a heavier, brownish clay. At 2.5 feet, I pulled the auger up and examined the soil on the bit. It was still dry, but when I crumbled it in my fingers, it felt different. It had a finer, almost greasy texture. I kept going. The work got slightly easier. The ground had a bit more give. I was no longer fighting rock. I was cutting through dense, heavy earth. Then, at just shy of 3 feet, the feeling of the auger changed completely. The grinding, scraping resistance vanished. The bit suddenly felt sticky, like I had plunged it into a jar of cold molasses. It took all my strength to pull it back up. The last 6 inches of the auger screw were coated in a thick, dark, glistening muck. It wasn't mud. It was a deep, primordial-looking clay, the color of wet slate. And the smell that came off it was sharp and clean, the smell of the ocean on a cold day. The smell of brine. I touched a finger to the clay on the bit. It was cool and slick. I brought the finger to my tongue. The taste exploded in my mouth. Intensely salty, with a complex mineral tang underneath. It wasn't just salt. It was something more. It was the secret. The salt trace. My grandfather had been right. The calves had been right. It was here. It had been here all along, 3 feet below the surface, waiting. Never went deep, the note had said. For him, in his time, with all the other pressures of the farm, 3 feet of backbreaking labor into sun-baked clay on a hunch was too deep. For me, with his note and the calves as my guides, it was just deep enough. I stood there, breathing heavily, my hands trembling slightly, and I looked from the dark, salty clay on the auger to the herd of crooked-horned calves, now looking like sages on the distant hill. They had remembered. I knew immediately that what I had found was beyond my expertise. This wasn't just a matter of digging a bigger hole. The salty clay was a clue, not the final answer. I needed someone who could read the ground, someone who could tell me what this was, how deep it went, and whether it was a fluke or a feature. I went back to the house, washed the clay from my hands, and sat at the kitchen table. My first thought was the county extension office, but I dismissed it just as quickly. Peterson was a good kid, but he was a crops and cattle man. He dealt in what grew on top of the soil, not what lay beneath it. He would look at my sample, punch some numbers into a computer, and tell me I had saline soil that was unsuitable for agriculture. He would see it as a problem, not a possibility. I needed a different kind of expert. I thought about my grandfather's generation. They would have gone to the oldest dowser in the county, or the man at the well drilling company who had punched more holes in the earth than anyone else. Most of those men were gone now, so I did something I rarely did. I called the state university. I didn't ask for the agriculture department. I asked for the geology department. I got passed around a bit, from a secretary to a graduate student, and I was about to give up when a woman with a patient voice asked me to explain what I was looking for one more time. I told her simply. I said I was a farmer and I had found a deep saline clay deposit on my property, and that my livestock were showing an unusual attraction to the area. I mentioned the dry scour and the shallow depth. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then she said, "You need to talk to Dr. Albright. He's technically retired, but he still comes in. Let me see if I can find him." I was put on hold. I expected to be forgotten, but a few minutes later a new voice came on the line. It was a man's voice, gravelly and slow. "Albright here." I told him my story again. I explained about the calves, the notebook, the hand auger. I tried to be as precise as possible, describing the color and texture of the clay, the exact depth, the taste. He listened without interrupting. When I was finished, there was a long silence. I thought maybe the line had gone dead. Finally, he said, "You tasted it?" "Yes, sir," I said. "It's salty." Strong, another pause. "And the animals found it first?" "That's right. A scrub herd. They wouldn't leave the spot alone." I could almost hear the gears turning in his head. He was skeptical, as any scientist would be, but he was intrigued. A hydrogeologist, he told me, spends his life studying how water moves through the ground. The story I told him was a classic, almost mythic pattern, animal behavior pointing to a hidden resource. "I'm 2 weeks from cleaning out my desk for good," he said. "But this sounds more interesting than paperwork. I'll come out tomorrow morning, if that works for you." He arrived the next morning in a dusty station wagon that looked as old as he was. He was a tall, stooped man with kind eyes and hands stained with what looked like a lifetime of earth. He wasn't wearing a lab coat or carrying a clipboard. He had on worn field pants and carried a small, battered leather satchel. I took him out to the back 40. The calves were already at their morning ritual, sniffing and pawing at the edges of my dig site. Albright stopped and watched them for a long time before he even looked at the hole I'd dug. "They pay attention," he said, more to himself than to me. I showed him the auger hole. He knelt down, the movement slow and careful, and looked into the narrow opening. He didn't need to dig. He reached into his satchel and pulled out a thin metal probe with a wire attached to a small handheld meter. He lowered the probe into the hole until it touched the bottom. He fiddled with a dial on the meter and watched the needle. He didn't say anything. He pulled the probe out, wiped it clean, and then walked the length of the scour, his eyes scanning the ground with an intensity that made me feel like I'd been half-blind my whole life. He stopped every 10 yards or so, took a small soil sample, and touched it with the tip of another device from his bag. After about 20 minutes of this silent investigation, he came back to where I was standing by the hole. He looked at the meter in his hand again. Then he looked at the calves. Then he looked at the whole sweep of the dry, unpromising pasture. He went quiet. It was not an empty silence. It was a silence full of thought, of a mind connecting decades of knowledge to the data in front of him. I waited. I knew better than to interrupt a man who was listening to the ground. Finally, he let out a long, slow breath. He looked directly at me, and his face was lit with a kind of quiet, academic excitement. "Substantial," he said. The one word hung in the air. He saw the question in my eyes and elaborated. "This isn't just a salt lick, Mr. Davison. What you have here is a brine seep. There's a weak artesian spring. There's a deep saline aquifer, probably trapped in sandstone layers thousands of feet down. A geological fault, a crack in the rock, is allowing that brine to slowly migrate upwards under pressure." He pointed to the scour. "This depression isn't just from erosion. It's a very slight subsidence, a slump in the earth caused by that fault line. The brine isn't strong enough to make it to the surface as a flowing spring, but it's close enough to saturate the deep clay." He tapped the meter. "The conductivity is off the charts. And it's not just sodium chloride. My guess is it's rich in potassium, magnesium, selenium, all the trace minerals that modern, fast-growing grass is often deficient in. For livestock, this is medicine. It's a natural mineral supplement of a quality you could not buy in a bag." He shook his head in wonder. "In 40 years of fieldwork, I have seen this phenomenon precisely twice. Once in Wyoming and once in a government survey in Utah. I have never seen it on private farmland in this state. It's exceptional, my worthless pasture, my scrub cattle. It all clicked into place. The land wasn't poor. It was rich in a way no one had thought to measure. The cattle weren't foolish. They were expert prospectors. They had found the one thing that could turn this marginal land into a finishing pasture of incredible value. The vindication was quiet, standing there in the morning sun, but it was absolute. It was the quiet click of a key turning in a lock that had been waiting for generations. The news of the brine seep didn't spread like wildfire. It was my secret, and Dr. Albright was a man who respected the privacy of the land. He helped me understand what I had, not how to exploit it. His advice was simple. Don't try to drill it. Don't try to pump it. You'll change the pressure and you might lose it forever. The beauty of this is its subtlety. The animals know how to use it. Just make it a little easier for them, so that's what I did. I spent the next week not with an auger, but with a shovel and a stone boat. I dug out a shallow basin, about 10 feet across and no more than 2 feet deep, right over the heart of the seep. I didn't want a pool of water. I just wanted to expose the saturated clay. I lined the basin with fieldstone I gathered from the old walls on the property, creating a clean, permanent place for the animals to go. When I was done, the dark, mineral-rich clay was exposed at the bottom, glistening and accessible. Took the calves all of an hour to find it. They approached it cautiously at first, then with a growing confidence. They didn't gorge themselves. They would come, take a few licks of the clay, and then wander off to graze. It was a supplement, not a meal. The effects became visible within a month. Their shaggy coats started to slick off, revealing a healthy shine underneath. The angularity of their frames began to soften, filling out over their ribs and hips. They moved with a new calmness, a settled contentment. The wild, nervous energy was gone, replaced by the quiet confidence of animals that have everything they need. They were thriving. They were putting on weight on a pasture that the experts had sworn would starve them. The salty clay was the missing ingredient, the catalyst that allowed them to unlock the full value of the dry grass. By the time the first snows came, they were transformed. They were no longer scrub cattle. They were stout, healthy, and finishing beautifully. I never said a word to anyone at the co-op. I never mentioned it to Peterson. The proof was walking around on my back 40. I didn't need to boast. The land and the animals were doing the talking. One evening in late November, just as the sun was setting and painting the snow-dusted fields in shades of pink and gray, I saw the familiar headlights of Miller's truck coming down the lane. He didn't pull up to the house. He drove straight back to the fence line of the back 40 and stopped. He just sat there in his truck for a long time, the engine idling, watching. The calves were all gathered around the stone basin, their dark shapes stark against the snow. I pulled on my coat and walked out to meet him. I figured the time for conversation had come. I walked up to his driver's side window. He didn't roll it down right away. He just kept looking out at the cattle, a thoughtful, calculating expression on his face. Finally, the window hummed down. The warm air from his cab, smelling of clean upholstery and artificial pine air freshener, washed over me. "Evening," he said. "Evening, Miller." He nodded toward the herd. They put on weight. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, an observation from a man whose eye for cattle was as sharp as anyone's. "They did," I said. He looked at them for another long moment. Then his gaze shifted to the ground, to the stone-lined basin he had surely been wondering about for weeks. He looked back at me, and for the first time, the certainty in his eyes was gone. It was replaced by a grudging respect. "That pasture was always dry," he said quietly. "Always the first to burn up, last to green up." He paused. And then he delivered the only concession I would ever need. "Guess you saw something we didn't." He gave me a single, sharp nod. It was an apology, an acknowledgement, and a compliment all rolled into one. Then he rolled up his window, put the truck in gear, and drove away down the dark lane. I stood there in the cold, watching his taillights disappear. That was it. There was no grand scene of triumph, no moment of rubbing it in his face. There didn't need to be. The quiet nod, the simple admission from a man like Miller, was more satisfying than any public victory. It was a private acknowledgement between two men who worked the same earth, a quiet closing of a circle. I had listened to the land, I had trusted the animal, and I had honored the memory of my grandfather. The quiet satisfaction I felt was deep and lasting, like the brine seep itself. It was a reminder that the most valuable things are rarely the most obvious. Sometimes they're hidden, waiting for someone with enough patience to listen for a story the land has been trying to tell all along. I turned and looked at my herd, my 28 crooked-horned teachers. They were content, and so was I. You spend your whole life walking over the same ground, thinking you know it. You read the maps, you study the soil reports, you follow the advice of men with degrees. And you can build a good life that way. There's nothing wrong with it. But every now and then, you get a reminder that there are other maps, older maps. There's the map written in the flight of geese, the map written in the color of the subsoil, the map written in the instinct of a hungry animal. My grandfather knew that. He didn't have the time to follow the trail himself, but he did the next best thing. He left a note for whoever came after him. Never went deep. It was more than an observation. It was an invitation. It was a gift of curiosity passed down through time. Thirst knows the way down. The calves were thirsty for the minerals their bodies craved, and that thirst led them straight to the source. My thirst was for a different kind of thing. It was a thirst for connection, for a belief that the old ways and the old stories still held meaning in a world that was moving faster and faster. I trusted the animal, and the animal remembered what the map forgot. That piece of land is still the heart of my operation. I never did anything else to it. I didn't add fertilizer or try to plant better grass. The seep provides. The cattle I raise now, descendants of those first 28, are known for their health and their flavor. The minerals from that deep earth get into their bones and their muscle, and you can taste the difference. People call it terroir when they talk about wine. I guess this is the terroir of my farm, a secret flavor that comes from 3 feet below the surface. The value of that land was never on a spreadsheet. It was in a faint pencil circle in a greasy notebook. It was in the stubborn, persistent memory of an animal that hadn't forgotten how to listen to the earth. It's a lesson I try to remember every day. Pay attention, trust the old stories, and don't be afraid to dig a little deeper than anyone has before. If you've got your own piece of ground that others have given up on, or an old story from your father or grandfather that you just can't shake, I'd be honored to hear about it in the comments. Subscribe if this meant something to you. Thanks for stopping by.